So, some people have said, well, after your statehood, you just decided you didn't want it. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Except that in 1915, within less than one generation from our statehood in Utah, 3 years from your statehood, our legislature in Utah sent a resolution to Congress saying, hey, you need to go back to that liberal policy, those compacts starting in 1780 that we'll look at here in just a moment. You need to go back and perform. You need to do that duty. We have less than 1/3 taxable land. We can't educate our children. Get on with it. By the 1920s, all of the lower 48 are now states, and Arizona and New Mexico and all the western states got together and said, hey, you're not disposing of our land like you promised. We can't tax the land to educate our kids. We can't grow our economy, provide good paying jobs. You're hoarding all resources. Put pressure on President Hoover. President Hoover convened a commission for the disposal of the public lands. That commission led to congressional hearings, and if you can see at the top of the congressional record on the hearings that they held in 1932, do you see that? It says, granting remaining unreserved public lands to the states. Not if, just how. Now the agencies that were working with the president on the commission, they proposed legislation, and their proposed legislation was, we're going to grant all the land to the state. That's our duty. It's a trust. We have to grant that land. We know that. We're going to grant you all of the surface rights. We'll just keep all the minerals. And the western states in the middle of the Depression mobilized themselves and descended upon Washington and said, I don't think so. You're not going to give us the burden without the benefit. Because in the western states, the value of the land is in the minerals. And they killed that attempt to change the obligation. Now your own Thomas Maddock, original member of the Arizona legislature, he was a Colorado River commissioner and all kinds of other important things in Arizona. He was asked to address the western governors in 1931, and his remarks are attached to this congressional record in 1932. He had things like this to say: the public land question is older than our nation. The pledge of the state lands to the nation provided the security upon which Hamilton established our credit, as well as settle the overlapping claims of the states to the territory west of the Allegheny Mountains. You see, here's what happened. You may ask the question, how did the federal government ever come to have title to these lands in the first place? Why did we ever get there, right? You go back to 1763. And in 1763, when the king granted the colonial charters to the colonies, he said, here's your colony, here's the boundary of your colony. And to 7 of them, he said, you can have claim over the western lands. 6 of them, no claims. You get the boundary of your colony. 7 of them have claims, that word, they use that word. 7 of you have claim over the western lands. 1776 now, right? Lives, fortunes, sacred honor. And they sign that pledge and they look to Robert Morris and they say, Robert, we want you to finance this operation. Why don't you run down to the First International Bank and just float a loan against the most powerful, well-equipped, well-funded, well-trained military in the world? Robert Morris funded the first $2 million of the revolution by himself in 1776. By 1780, Robert Morris is broke, and the nation, this group of states, is broke. The war is not over. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? The British are descending upon them. What are we going to do? What do states do when they need more money? They can't borrow, right? He just went down. He tried to go down, and who's going to? Would you loan money on that deal? You're out of money in 1780. You're out of money, and you got the British just steaming down on you.
Go to another country.
Go to another country. You're going to loan money on that deal?
No.
Raise taxes, perhaps, right? Raise taxes on the original Tea Party crowd. Are you going to do that?
Oh no, print more money.
The 7 said, we're not going there. The 7 said, you know what? We have claims to these western lands. We'll sell our claims to the western lands. You 6, good luck. Imagine if you're one of the 6. Imagine if you're one of the 6. The 6 said, we're going to have to raise taxes. You're going to sell claims to the western lands? We're contributing our blood and treasure into this operation. Our people are going to leave our states because we're raising taxes. They're going to go to your states, and we're putting our blood and treasure into this, and you're going to be these big landed states at the end of this deal? It doesn't work for us. We're not good with this. Done. Imagine, at the very birth of our nation, Continental Congress stepped up and said, we have an idea. Let us have the land. Time out. Fighting a war against a land baron. Our first act in the founding of our nation is not going to be the establishment of a land baron, no matter how perilous this is. Oh, no. What we meant to say, and they came back with a resolution in 1780. What we meant to say was, we'll hold these lands in trust. And with the emails that you'll do, I'll send you these slides, and unfortunately I tried to shorten this up, but it's just such good stuff. What the resolution says is, be it resolved that the unappropriated lands, which is the word that we still use today, because this is where the public land question started. Be it resolved that the unappropriated lands which shall be ceded to the United States by the states shall be disposed of for the common benefit, that meant to fund the war, and shall be formed into distinct republican states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as all the other states. And it'll be granted under such regulations as Congress may prescribe. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. On that basis, New York ceded its lands only to create new states, only to pay the debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. 3 other states did the same thing before the Constitution. North Carolina and Georgia, they don't cede their lands until 1802. Georgia in 1802, they were the last one. Well, that's way after the Constitution. Why are they still doing that when we have a Constitution? You see in Article 6, Clause 1 of the Constitution, it says all engagements entered into before the Constitution shall be valid and binding after the Constitution. And in the Congressional Public Lands testimony and hearings in the 1830s, they call this one of the engagements that was the basis upon which states relied in ceding their land, which formed the very basis for the foundation of our nation. But for that, we may have perished at birth as a nation. That's how critical this public lands question is. This is where the public land question started. You're Thomas Maddock. I will show you, and again in the slides that we send to you, after they win the war, Thomas Jefferson drafts a land ordinance. And in the land ordinance drafted by Thomas Jefferson, he says, the new states shall never interfere with the primary disposal of the lands by the United States, nor with any regulations to secure title in the bona fide purchasers. Federal government's a trustee. Don't interfere with that. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, in July of 1787, same thing. The new states will be on an equal footing. Don't interfere with the primary disposal of the soil or with any regulations to secure soil in the bona fide purchasers. Federal government's a trustee. Don't interfere with that. Then you get to Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution, known as the Property Clause. And it says Congress shall have the power to dispose of the territory and make needful rules and regulations, and Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims. Remember that word claim from 1763 and 1780. Nothing in the Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of the particular states. You see, that provision of the Constitution, they said, we already solved this public lands question back in 1780. That provision of the Constitution is simply to preserve the status quo. That's what the congressional debate on that section says. We're simply going to preserve the status quo on the western lands. The states took their claims in 1780 and they put them in trust. The United States as trustee had claim over those lands to use them as collateral to pay the debt of the war. Now look at what Thomas Maddock then says. He says, he quotes, in 1932, he quotes the Congressional Public Land Committee report from 1832. And he says, let me look over here. He says, the public debt now being paid, the only time in our nation's history in 1832, how would that be? The public debt now being paid, the public lands are entirely released from the pledge they were under to that object and are free to receive a new and liberal destination for the relief of the states in which they lie. The speedy extinction of the federal title within their limits is necessary to the independence of the new states. Without the extinction of title, the states are not free the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence, right? It's necessary to the independence of the new states and to their equality with the older states, to the development of their resources, to the subjection of their soil to taxation, cultivation, and settlement, and to the proper enjoyment of their jurisdiction and sovereignty. The ramified machinery, I had to look that word up. It's like this obsolete and sclerotic, bad, really bad. The ramified machinery of the Land Office Department and the ownership of so much soil extends the patronage and authority of the general government into the heart and the corners of the new states and subjects their policy to the danger of a foreign and powerful influence. This was your Thomas Maddock. But of course you just gave up your land. You didn't want it, right? So they stopped that horrible proposition that, yes, we'll keep our promise and we'll transfer the land to you, we'll just keep all the minerals, and the states in the middle of the Depression stopped that. Now, I've heard some people say, well, it was the Taylor Grazing Act. So 2 years after that, in 1934, Congress passed a stopgap measure to manage the public lands known as the Taylor Grazing Act. It's the precursor to the BLM. I've heard many say, oh, well, that's where the states gave up their land, in the Taylor Grazing Act, you see. Well, if you look at the first line of the Taylor Grazing Act, it says, in order to promote the highest use of the public lands, pending its final disposal. You see, the obligation that was undertaken in 1780 had been the same from 1780 through the Land Ordinance of 1784 and 1787 and the Constitution in 1787 and the Public Lands Committees in the 1830s and 40s and 50s when Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas exercised their knowledge and courage and succeeded in the transfer of their lands. And you see in those Supreme Court cases that we saw all the way up to our statehood and reiterated again in all of our statehood enabling acts that the federal government is obligated to dispose of the land. And we understood that, and Congress understood that all the way up until 1976, when they said it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. It's now our policy, our unilateral policy, to retain these lands in federal ownership. Never mind the solemn compact that formed the very basis of our nation in that perilous time of 1780. Never mind the Land Ordinance of 1784, 87, the Constitution, the court opinions, the Congressional Public Lands hearings, the fact that they did transfer the land to the other states and our statehood enabling acts. Throw all that out the window because we have a unilateral policy to retain these lands. 1976. In 1976. That's known as the Federal Land Policy Management Act. Now, lest you think that the benevolent federal government would not give you something in exchange for this deal that was imposed upon the states, here's the deal. We know that you could tax your lands and you could govern yourself and you could use your resources and your forests to educate your children and take care of your own communities, but we're going to pay you to not utilize your lands and resources. We're going to pay you to not tax your lands, and that's called payment in lieu of taxes or PILT. What that works out to be is about 13 cents on the dollar because you, dear supervisor, you would rather have 13 cents than a dollar, apparently. Also, we're going to pay you to not use your forest resources because we would rather allow the trees to build up and manage them for maximum combustion, and we would rather that you not govern yourselves and generate jobs and generate the tax revenue and the multiplier effect and the satisfaction of governing yourself. We'll pay you. Now that's called secure rural schools. Now I learned in law school, my tax professor in law school taught me that if you put the word not in front of any piece of federal legislation, you're going to be more accurate 90% of the time. So in the Not Secure Rural Schools Act, what they said is we will pay you to not utilize your forest resources. And that money would go right into schools and local communities. Now also, if you're North Dakota, remember North Dakota? You get to control 100% of the access to your resources, and you get 100% of the mineral royalties in your state. But if you're on the west side of that arbitrary federal fault line, you get to control 20%, 30% of the access to your lands perhaps. And we've got a deal for you. You'll get 48 cents instead of a dollar. Because you like 48 instead of a dollar, apparently. You get 48% of the mineral royalty in your state. That was the deal. But they also said in this deal that was imposed upon the states, you're going to have a multiple use and a sustained yield with local planning. Doesn't that sound great? How well is that working out? That was the deal. That was the deal, right? So now let's go forward and see what happened to that. We're going to get to, this is a little 3-minute video of Senator Lisa Murkowski. She's the ranking member of the Senate Natural Resources Committee. This is just a couple of months ago, talking about this deal that was imposed upon the states. Matt, if you could cue that.
The community of Wrangell, where I went to elementary school, is a community where 64% of their budget for the school comes from Secure Rural Schools funding. When they don't know where 64% of their budget is going to be coming from on a year-to-year basis, it causes a great deal of stress. The PILT program, of course, is permanent, so we're not concerned about the program expiring, but what we are concerned about is the level at which the program is funded. PILT was created in 1976 by Congress because we changed our federal land policy from one that was focused on disposal to one that was focused on retention. These payments are literally payments in lieu of taxes to compensate our local governments for the loss in tax revenue caused by this change in policy. Secure Rural Schools, unlike PILT, was largely a replacement program for the receipt-sharing programs, whether it's the Forest Service payments to states and the Bureau of Management that Oregon and California have for their payments. These payments made under these programs were historically from receipts generated by timber sales for roads and school purposes. But I think we recognize that they were never intended to be a permanent entitlement program, but more specifically a temporary, short-term bridge to allow the communities to transition to the new economic reality that was forced upon them by environmental policies that were designed to halt timber harvesting. But if you're a community like Ketchikan, where I was born down in southeast Alaska, Ketchikan, their private taxable lands within the Ketchikan Gateway Borough are 0.3%. 0.3%. So if you have no other place to go, if 96.5% of the land in your borough is held by the federal government, the state has 1.3%, the local government has 0.3%, there is 0.3% that is taxable land. So when you say you've got this federal policy that says you can't harvest within the Tongass because we're just saying you can't harvest in the Tongass, and you have no place to go for your tax base, and we say, well, this is just going to be a temporary program for you until you can transition. The question is, what do you transition to? But I think we all know, I mean, we're having budget conversations this week. It's on everybody's mind. Federal government's broke here. We can't continue to pay counties to not utilize the lands within their boundaries. And, Mr. Chairman, you have appropriately suggested where we need to go with this. You need to be able to access the resources that are on your lands. We either need to utilize our federal lands to generate the revenue and the jobs for our rural communities, or we should divest the federal government of those lands and let the states or the counties, the boroughs manage them.
Right. That's Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Now, mostly right. Mostly right. But in 1976, she said, we changed our policy from one of disposal to one of retention. No, actually, you changed the very solemn compact that formed our nation and the Constitution and the court precedents and the enabling acts and everything else that went into that obligation from disposal to retention. But think of what she said. We imposed this policy until you could transition to the new economic reality. So if your state in Arizona, I was really impressed when we were down in the Senate rooms yesterday, and the seal of Arizona is all about the resources of the land. That is what the state was founded upon. And so we're going to take all that resource and tie it behind your back and say, transition to the new economic reality. And they said, we're going to pay you to not utilize your lands and resources. And she said, federal government is broke. By every objective measure, we know that. The American Institute of CPAs, our Utah Association of CPAs, they're now coming out and in their words, pulling the financial fire alarm. That it's just a matter of math. This isn't Republicans and Democrats. This is a math problem now. But do you see what she said? We can't afford to keep paying counties to not utilize their lands and resources. We can't afford to do that. And so we need to open up access to these lands, or, she says, we need to divest the lands and let the states and the counties manage them. Well, amen. Right? There's knowledge. The only thing lacking is courage. That's where this comes from. They know, mostly, there's still some knowledge gaps, but the courage, and that comes from here. And that comes from our governors and our attorney generals and our state representatives, and that's what this movement is about, passing these bills. Knowledge and courage. That comes from our congressional delegation that gains the knowledge, and from you, when you hire them next year, you give them the courage. Right? So, but this is what's happening. You remember in August of 2011, the federal government is pathologically incapable of balancing a budget. In fact, they have not had a balanced budget since before iPads were invented. It's been more than 4 years since the federal government has had a budget, let alone balance it. It's been decades since they balanced one. And so what they did in August of 2011, they came up against the debt ceiling again. There was the downgrade of the credit of the United States. I mean, think about that. The credit was downgraded, and so the proposal was, well, we don't think we could ever balance the budget ourselves, and so we're going to do the Budget Control Act. And what the Budget Control Act says is, if by January 1 of 2013, we can't pass a budget that can cut $85 billion a year of the overspend. We're overspending $1 trillion a year. We're going to cut that by $85 billion. If we can't do that, then automatically there will be automatic cuts of $85 billion a year, and that is called sequestration. You remember New Year's Eve, all the hair on fire in Congress? They couldn't do that. And so sequestration triggered to go into effect on March 1 to cut $85 billion. Do you know that on February 28th, the day before, the federal government overspent $87 billion on that one day? But under sequestration that went into effect, we're going to have them automatic across-the-board cuts. What's happening right now is we're cutting money right out of Title I programs, special needs, and the neediest of our children right out of the schools right now. It's happening right now. It's not if or when that 52% that the state of Arizona is reliant upon a fiscally suicidal federal government. It's not if or when, it's right now. Now also in that, you remember that promise that you liked, Supervisor? Because you like 13 apparently more than $1? And that's your revenue. Under the guise of the federal government cutting its expenses, it's now reaching in to your pocket and cutting that payment in lieu of the taxes right now. Now you remember also that if you're North Dakota, you get 100% of your mineral royalty, but dear Supervisor, you apparently liked 48 cents more than $1, or at least so they imposed upon the western states. They're cutting that right now. Now, under the guise of cutting their expense, they're cutting that revenue as well. It's happening right now. Now, the federal mineral lease, we did fortunately have the Western Attorney General begin to band together. And they sent letters and demanded and made the case that you have no right to do that on that program. And they got a letter back just recently that said, you know, maybe you're right, and we'll think about giving your money back in 2014 if nothing else changes. But at least they're banding together, our attorneys general are, and they're beginning to move on this, which is a very, very good thing. Now also, you remember the Not Secure Rural Schools program? Under the guise of cutting federal expenses, they're now reaching in and cutting that revenue. But they're not just stopping at cutting the revenue going forward. Under the Secure Rural Schools program, they're reaching back in time and saying you have to pay back the money you've already spent. That's happening right now. Also happening right now